money is nothing more than a claim on energy. So we're kind of right back to the beginning. It all comes back to energy in the end. It always does. And I don't say that because that's my field. It's because energy is the organizing principle of life. And every animal on earth except humans understands that.
I am joined today by Art Berman. Art, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Pleasure to be with you here.
We have a lot to get into, but I want to make sure that viewers and listeners are fully on the same page to start. So, as basic as this might sound, I'd love to start with an overview of what is oil?
Well, oil is what runs the world. Oil is the economy, contrary to what many people think. Oil is a molecule. It is a liquid that is the highest density form of energy that we know, which is also relatively abundant, cheap, and transportable insofar as you can put it in a bucket, you can put it in a pipeline, you can put it on a boat, you can do whatever you want. A lot of forms of energy, for example, electricity, you got to put up a wire if you want to move it. Natural gas, you got to put it in a pipeline, or you have to figure out a way to super chill it so you can put it on a special boat. And on the other side of wherever you're sending it, they have to have reverse equipment to get it back to you. So oil is pretty unique stuff. Coal is equally transportable. At the same time, it has some other problems. It's not as energy dense as oil, and of course, it creates a lot more atmospheric emissions and other problems. But this is the all other things being equal. I mean, this is why fossil fuels are, have been our energy source of choice, because they're abundant, cheap, and easy to move around, certainly relative to other things.
So that brings up two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, what are the other products associated with oil that people don't necessarily think about? And kind of building on your points around the fact that oil is so portable and energy dense, how does that relate to what people call renewables?
Yeah, well, so where to start here? First of all, there is no such thing as renewable energy. The whole concept of renewable energy violates the laws of thermodynamics, which governs physics in the universe, which says that energy can neither be created or destroyed. And so, unless you want to take on the laws of thermodynamics, there is no such thing as renewable energy. There's also no such thing as clean energy. Okay, well, let me change that. All energy is clean until you use it. It's transforming energy into work that creates the byproducts, which are not clean. So, clean energy is an oxymoron, and renewable energy is an oxymoron. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not opposed to renewable energy. In fact, I'm very much in favor of it. I just want to, since we're getting on the same page with our audience here, I want to get a few things out in front of them so we don't have to, get them any more confused than they already are. Remind me again what the first part of your question was.
Oh, the associated products that emerge from the oil industry.
So nobody uses oil. I mean, the only people in the world that use oil are refiners. So we all use the products of oil, which is to say gasoline and diesel and kerosene and propane and butane and plastics and asphalt, and I mean, you name it. So those are the products, and of course, most people understand that from those products, an awful lot of other things are made, like most of the clothing that you're wearing, or medicines. Or, I mean, just virtually everything that is around you right now is made of some byproduct of petroleum or oil. And I'm not saying that as a some sort of a slogan to say that oil is great. It's just the way it is.
So, factoring those two things and thinking about activist movements like Just Stop Oil, why is the idea of just stopping oil not something that's tenable from a literal standpoint? To leave aside whatever sort of activist vector it might be pushing forward.
If you want to collapse civilization, just stop oil. It's really just that simple. And again, I'm just to be clear, I do not question, doubt, or dispute the fact that most of our emission problems are from fossil fuels. I mean, you can't dispute that any more than you can the laws of thermodynamics. That's a fact. It's also a fact that just stopping oil would absolutely crater civilization as we know it right now. And I'm sure that's a kind of a shocking thing for a lot of our viewers and listeners to hear. But let me just back off a little bit. There are four things upon which modern civilization rests. In other words, without these four things, it would collapse. And they are steel, concrete, plastic, and ammonia or fertilizer. Okay? We have no way of making any of those four things at any kind of scale usable at a civilization level independent of fossil fuels. And primarily, it's just because of the levels of heat that are required. So most people don't think about, maybe they think about steel, and most everybody can imagine some image they saw in elementary school or middle school of a blast furnace. Okay, you can picture that. It's real hot, right? I mean, red hot steel and or iron ore, the whole thing. Most of us don't think that much about concrete, but I mean, go outside, go look at what the sidewalk is made of. I mean, look at it closely, or the driveway, or the street, or whatever, and what you'll see is that it's mostly pebbles of various kinds of rocks that are floating in a matrix of basically limestone. Okay, it's a white substance. Now, to make that concrete requires sustained temperatures of about 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit for days. Okay, so we're back to the blast furnace problem. Could you do that with electricity? Yeah, sure, you could do it. Could you do it at the scale that we need, concrete and steel? No. Could you do it for a cost that would be affordable for all the concrete and steel that we use? No. What would you do about intermittency? What would you do if all of a sudden you're doing that with renewable energy and the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining? Well, you can't stop those processes. You stop those processes and you throw away whatever you were working on. Okay, so that's two of the four. Plastics. There is no source, and plastics are awful. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we really opened Pandora's box with plastics, 50, 75 years ago. But, be that as it may, um, there is only one source of the raw materials of plastic in the world. Well, there's two. One is oil, and the other is natural gas. Okay, so we're back to fossil fuels. Ammonia. Okay, the only reason that we have 8+ billion people on the earth today is because of fertilizer, which allows the earth to feed that number of people. Now, I am not a proponent of 8.5 billion people on the earth. When I was born in 1950, there were 2.5 billion. And that's about the right number. Not that there's anything magic about 1950 or the fact that I was born in that year, but that's a population that Earth can sustain. Okay, so um, the only way that we were able to grow the population more than three times what it was in 1950 was by supercharging the soil with fertilizer. Where does fertilizer come from? It's made with natural gas. Okay, now are there other ways of making it? Yeah, you can do it with hydrogen and various kinds of electrolysis, but you're back to the same conundrum that I described with running a blast furnace or making concrete with electricity. They're very inefficient processes. They're ridiculously expensive, and you just can't do it at scale. So when you read something in the paper or whatever, wherever you get your news, and it's great breakthrough. Somebody's figured out how to do X, Y, Z. Oh, we can make clean hydrogen, no problem. Well, the problem with that is it's a pilot project. It's like nuclear fusion. Yeah, we got a couple of of joules of electricity in some sort of reaction that in a machine that cost $20 billion to build, and it only took 10 years to get there, and we can't do it again. But pretty soon we're off to the races, and oh my God, we're going to have. I mean, fusion's going to be running the world in 5 or 6 years. Well, you know, let's just leave it at that and say, I wish all those things were true, but that's just not the way the world works. So clearly, there is a major disconnect between the popular conception of what would happen if we just stopped oil and what would actually happen. Now, I think most just stop oil people are sensible and realistic to the extent that their experience allows them to be. And they're saying, look, these emissions are, they're going to destroy society and possibly the world, and they're 100% right about that. No argument. Okay, but that doesn't mean okay. I need to lose 50 pounds in 3 weeks, so I'm gonna cut off my right leg and my left arm, and I'll be there. Yeah, you can do that. But if I wanted to lose that weight to compete in some event, well, I'm probably not going to be able to do it with one leg and one arm. I mean, these are the sorts of things that people, and I don't want to imply that these people are are stupid or anything. They just don't know. And why should they? I mean, they're not in the field I'm in, and so I'm telling you, as someone who's spent nearly 50 years in this field, you just can't do those things unless you're willing to accept the consequences of a collapsed civilization. It's kind of that simple. If you don't
Mm.
have concrete and steel, you can't build anything. You can't make any roads. Let's talk about electric vehicles. What are the two major components of an electric car? Steel and plastic. What are the main components of a wind turbine? Steel and plastic. I mean, you just can't get away from these damn things. And you say, well, maybe someday in the future we'll figure it out. Well, okay, great, maybe. I wouldn't want to bet my portfolio on that, but if you also believe the urgency of just stop oil, I mean, we don't have forever to figure this stuff out. I mean, we've pretty much got to figure out what we're going to do in the next couple of years, or let's say be generous, 10 years maybe. Um, and if we don't even have any idea how to do it, then the odds of being able to do it at scale in 5 or 10 years are pretty close to zero. I mean, that's just, again, call me a pessimist, but I've been in science long enough to know that that's how long it takes to scale something up. You discover an oil field, great, everybody's happy, celebrating if you're in the oil business. And 7, 8, 9 years later, maybe you're producing your first oil. I mean, that's an easy thing to do compared to, to fusion or, green hydrogen. I mean, these are things that we know how to do. It just takes a long time because it's hard. We're talking about things we don't know how to do. So it's not only hard, we don't know how to do it. That's a problem.
It's a massive problem.
It is a massive problem. And again, I don't expect that most people understand or have even heard these things before. But I mean, if you believe 15% of what I'm saying, and you should believe 100%, but if you only believe 15% or 10%, that's going to put a certain risk on how much you believe all the rest of the stuff that people are telling you is just around the corner or tomorrow. The
Mm,
bottom line for me is we are in grave danger of destroying life on Earth, not just because of climate change, but because of the growth of the human project. And you're not going to fix that. Well, you're not going to fix that. Let's just leave it there. Your best bet is to try to figure out how you're going to cope with it.
mm, mm,
And once you've figured out how to cope with it, you might be prepared to start thinking about ways that you could not fix it, but at least make it not as bad or a little bit better. I mean, do what you want, but it's like somebody in your family is about to die. Oh, can we fix this? Well, depends, right? Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, if they're old and they're sick, chances are no. The best we can do is prolong their life a little bit more. So the best thing I can do is prepare myself for the eventuality of what we all kind of agree is probably going to happen. And
mm,
that's what I think we ought to be considering, at least as a plan B, as we contemplate the human predicament and the things that are probably in front of us. And again, I don't want to be a downer, but I don't want to fill people with all kinds of expectations that they're going to be not only disappointed about but angry with me because I told them, okay, it's going to be all right. I'm not saying it's going to be terrible. Well, it's not going to be good. I certainly don't think that the human species is going to become extinct. We could, I mean, if we get into a nuclear war, but I'm not one of those people. I think there is a future. It's just going to be so different from what we imagine the future to be that we need to understand what we're signing up for when people come and say just stop oil, or people come and say, oh, we need a 100% renewable world. Okay, let's talk about what are we signing up for, and if you agree with kind of the broad range of what that implies, then I'm all for it. I think that's great. I don't think most people have a clue what they're signing up for.
yeah. I had just building on your point about sort of doomerism, I had Paul Ehrlich on, an episode a few weeks back
Okay.
and, brought up the point about alarmism, and he just very bluntly said, "Yes, we're alarmist because we're alarmed." It's like this very straightforward thing. Um,
Well, and he makes a good point. I mean, there's an awful lot of mistrust in our world and certainly in our country today in the United States. It's not unique to the United States. There's plenty of it elsewhere in the world, but this is what I know the best. And we mistrust our legal system, and we mistrust our politicians, and we mistrust our scientists. Okay, and it's like, well, let's just stop government. We could do that, and I don't think it takes too much imagination, whichever end of the political spectrum you're on, to see that that would be a disaster. For as much as we might agree, let's just say that all those guys in Washington are a bunch of corrupt, disreputable criminals. Let's just say that's true. I don't think that's true, but let's just say it is. Well, if government stops, then it's a disaster for as bad as it is. Okay, and so why is it that everybody thinks they know more about science than scientists? I mean, I deal with this all the time. I tell people, well, look, I've studied this, and if that's something, let's just say climate change, it is a real problem. It's not, it's not a hoax. And people start arguing with me because they got their PhD at Google University or something. Well, I mean, if you want to believe that everybody in the science community is as corrupt and disreputable as everybody in Congress, you can stop science too, just like you can stop government. At the same time, usually the same folks that are saying that are the ones that are saying, "Oh yeah, but look at AI and look at nuclear fusion and look at colonizing." Well, guys, those are the same scientists that brought you that are also telling you that we've got a real problem with what we're doing to the planet. So, is this some sort of psychotic thing where, you believe what you want to believe and you say the rest of it's a hoax? And again, I don't want to get into the psychology of it because it's too frightening. But that's kind of where we're at. And so, this discussion we're having, I'm sure there's going to be people who hear it and their reaction is, that Berman guy, he's out of his mind. Where'd he come from? And well, that's a good question, I suppose. But I mean, but I am representing the views of the great majority of people who have studied these issues. I mean, I tell people all the time, do you debate with your cardiologist about his equipment and his diagnosis and his surgical techniques if you have a heart problem? If you do, good luck with that. That doesn't mean that he's right, okay? I mean, get a second, get a third, get a fourth or she opinion. But I mean, do you do that really? I mean, do you argue with your neurosurgeon about what tools he's going to use and which technique he's going to use to cut a hole in your brain and fix, to remove a tumor? I don't think Google University is that good. And yet everybody feels fully qualified to say, oh, all you guys that are saying climate change is a problem, or the decline of animal species, or the acidification of the ocean, or the overshooting of our financial system, that's a crock. You're just a bunch of alarmists. So I'm with Paul Ehrlich on this. I mean, I'm alarmed. Call me an alarmist. I say that's that's objective science that's motivating my alarm, and I didn't want to believe any of this stuff either. Okay, I'm just like you guys. First time I heard about climate change, that's nuts. That can't be. All right, I've studied it, and geez, yeah, it is. I'm sorry. And
Mm.
and climate change is not even the biggest problem we've got. I mean, it's a relatively minor problem compared to a lot of other stuff. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, I'm glad you are, not because I want to come back to it, and I realized in my excitement in talking with you, I forgot to invite you to share a little bit about your background. So you've referenced a few times
Oh,
um, what your
yeah.
background is, but I'd love if listeners could have a deeper context to your career and interests.
Okay. So I have an undergraduate degree in Middle Eastern history and a master's degree in earth science. I spent the first 20 years of my life working for a big oil company, and I've spent the last 24 or 5 years consulting for all kinds of people. Some of them were big oil companies, small oil companies, but most of them are investment funds and environmental groups and indigenous tribes who are concerned about being screwed by oil companies, and various legal situations that require someone to come in and say, well, here's the truth about things. And my interests have expanded. I mean, if I had to give a one-liner, I mean, I'm an energy expert, but energy includes pretty much everything. I mean, it's hard to be an energy expert without knowing an awful lot about economics and geopolitics and systems theory and climate and astrophysics. I mean, that's the reason I went into earth science, because it's really hard to get bored with it. I've never gotten bored with it. So that's what I do, and I do. These days, I take on a few projects that interest me, but most of each day I spend doing what we're doing right now, trying to provide information. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind or convince anyone of what I think we ought to be doing, because honestly, I don't know what we ought to be doing. But there is a there are a few tens or hundreds of thousands of people that come to me through social media or my website or whatever every day, and they just want to know what's the truth about this. Not what's right and what's wrong. I mean, I had somebody today say, "Well, I just heard that earthquakes in West Texas are somehow related to to disposing of water that comes out of oil wells. Is that true?" And the answer is, well, yeah, it's true, and it's been known for quite a while. You just found out about it. That's fine. And yeah, you put water under pressure down a hole into a reservoir, and if it finds its way to a fault, it can lubricate that fault, and the fault moves a little bit, and you got a little earthquake. And here's a link. Check it out, and get back to me if you want to know more. I mean, that's what I do most days of the week. Now that's a fairly mundane issue, but here was a guy who just said, "Is this true? I mean, can this really be?" Yeah, it can really be. And if you don't believe me, here's a link, and get back to me if you got more questions. That's what I do.
Mm, wonderful. And you also coined the term energy blindness in terms of thinking about how you're referencing how being an expert in energy means that you're kind of uh, studying and learning about all these different fields and keeping tabs on everything that's going on in these various seemingly disconnected places. And energy blindness seems like a really important sort of, you know, sort of like liquid concept that connects them all.
I didn't invent that term, but
Oh,
I'm glad to be associated with it. I'm not really sure who did, but I suspect it was my friend Nate Hagens. It might have been my other friend DJ White. It was some member of of my circle of my network of experts. No, I didn't coin it, but I'm sure one of them did. But it's true. Okay, so it doesn't matter who came up with it. It's people, particularly our leaders, are energy blind, and it's not their fault. Okay, they just are. Most people are. It's I'm I call somebody to to work on my air conditioner because I'm HVAC blind. I know how to turn it on. I know what it does. I know when it's not working. But I'm not the guy to go out there and maintain it and fix it if it's not work. I mean, that's just not what I do. I'm and I think and that's the way I look at energy blindness. All of us use energy, like I use my AC and my heating. We know what it is. We know when it's working, when it's not working, and we know who to call if we need to know more. So I'm very comfortable being HVAC blind, as I think most people should be comfortable being energy blind, but know who to call if you want to know. And the problem we run into, particularly with our political leaders, is they don't call, or they call the people that tell them, "Yeah, you're right." And I mean that's it's never been any different. So I'm not That shouldn't be a revelation to anybody, and I'm not accusing them of being corrupt or anything. That's just the way it is. I mean, a politician, okay, I got this situation, I need three talking points. Well, I mean, obviously, when I described the four pillars of civilization, those were four talking points, and it took me a couple of minutes to work through everyone. And the politician, he said, "All right, I'm out of here. I can't get reelected on that. That's too complicated." So he's blind because he doesn't have the time to understand something that won't help him or her achieve their goal, which is to get reelected. Okay, so I mean that's their job. Their job is to get reelected. And I've had all sorts of conversations behind closed doors on Capitol Hill with lawmakers, Congress people, who fully agree with me on a lot of these things, and they just say, "Yeah, but look, you got to repackage this for me." I mean, if I say what you just said, I'm not going to get reelected, and I can't do that.
Mm. So let's make it explicit because you've written about this. What is the relationship between oil and productivity? And as a follow-up connection, how is that connected to our ideas of progress, our narratives around progress?
So there's a statistically perfect correlation between oil consumption and economic activity or gross domestic product. I mean, it's so good you almost don't believe it, except that it's true, and it makes sense when you think about it. That I mean, what is the economy? It's it's activity that results from work. Okay, you have to work to make something happen. Where does work come from? Well, work is how you convert energy into action. And so it makes complete sense when you think about it that energy is what drives activity, it's what drives work. And the economy is nothing more than an aggregate of all the work that everybody does. And sure, there's a certain amount of work that's just from the frosted flakes and milk that I ate this morning. But compared to the work that we get from a barrel of oil or a ton of coal, it's insignificant. So just to put a fine point on that, 1 barrel of oil contains the work equivalent of what you or I can do in 4.5 years. I mean, that's an astonishing fact. And it's not disputable. I mean, we know exactly how much work, energy, comes out of a barrel of oil because we can burn it and measure it. And the number of calories or joules or whatever you want to measure it in compared to what the human body is capable of doing in a year. And that 4.5 years is discounted for efficiency and all kinds of stuff. So you get 4.5 years of work out of a barrel of oil that costs you today $60. And people complain about they complain about the price of oil. That's a whole nother conversation. So so if you got something that for $60 will give you 4.5 human years of work, that's the definition of productivity. Okay, right there. And so we can talk about what are the relative amounts of work of equivalent other forms of energy, but the only thing you need to know is they're all less. They're all a lot less than oil. So we had a civilization that existed up until about 225 years ago, in which the main way to get work done was the human body, animals, and burning wood or dung or something like that. And that was by and large a world that was based on agriculture, and it was kind of a subsistence world for most people. And then we figured out how to use coal and later on oil and natural gas, and now we've got all sorts of other things, nuclear and renewables. And all of those things were much more productive than me and my ox or me and my draft horse, and more productive by a factor of what I just told you, 4.5 years of work in a barrel of oil. So, you know, what a surprise that we had this thing called progress, where the wealth, I mean, the absolute amount of wealth that was created every year in the world was exponentially higher than it was a couple of 100 years ago. Okay, so that's, so that whole notion of things just keep getting better and better, at least in terms of material productivity. That's the basis for what some people like Daniel Schmachtenberger call the progress narrative. And the progress narrative says that, progress has always been. I just told you it really hasn't. It's relatively new phenomenon for human civilization, but fair enough. It's always been and it always will be. And anybody who doubts that we can recreate the past, let's just say, 100 or 50 years into the future, is some kind of an idiot, because of course they've got to be wrong. Why not? I mean, past is prelude, right? So that's the progress narrative, just plain and simple. Now, the fact that it's not true, that it's only been true for a relatively brief period of human history, and that it's predicated on cheap, abundant, high density energy, then in order for it to continue to be true, we have to have an inexhaustible supply of relatively cheap, abundant, high density energy, which we do not, because only so much of it was made and is available to us. So that's one part of the problem with the progress narrative. And the other part of the problem is it has consequences. That by using all of this stuff, aside from using it up, we are creating problems not only for ourselves, but for the biosphere, for life on Earth, which, maybe you don't care. Maybe somebody listening to this just couldn't care less about, what's going on with birds or various weird bugs or reptiles. But unfortunately, I mean, the reason that you clean your house is because if it gets too full of garbage and dirt and sewage, it ends up affecting your well-being. It ends up, you get sick because you're not keeping your house clean. And particularly that was true when we used to have animals living in our house. So, at some point, if we continue to degrade the, the ecosystem that supports our lives and prosperity, it's going to be bad for us, and it's already getting there. A lot of people don't understand that or appreciate it yet, but and that's another topic. So that's kind of the progress narrative, and why it has, we need to examine what the future of the progress narrative
Mm. I'd love to invite you to share more about what you where you stopped off right there in terms of how it's already, how we're already seeing it get bad.
Sure. So, I mean, let's just talk about something that everybody understands, which is uh, making it in the world today. And so, even young people, um, half or a third of my age, have somewhat fonder memories of how things were when they were younger, for one reason or another. And certainly in my memory, when I was a kid, Um, Very few families who lived in my neighborhood, which was just kind of a basic middle class, lower middle class kind of neighborhood. Um, Very few had more than one um, wage earning worker in the family. That there was one person who went to work every day, often at a factory manufacturing something or driving a truck or whatever. And that was good enough for that family to be okay and kids to go to school and have clothes and maybe even some of them go to college. And by the time, so that was 1950s and 60s, by the 80s or 90s, it became increasingly rare that a family could maintain those same basic requirements without two people working. Okay, and today I think that we've reached a point now after the financial crisis in 2006 through 8 and COVID and a bunch of other things where most everybody is aware of the fact that things are definitely not as good, not only as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, but just a few years ago. And this is not an American phenomenon. This is true pretty much everywhere in the world. And being humans, we want to blame somebody for it. And so, if Trump was the president, then it's all his fault. And if Biden's now it's all his fault, and all that. But the truth is that these problems have been accumulating without any particular reason, or at least certainly not because of what political party has been running the United States or the EU or whatever part of the world you're in. This is just what happens when you start to when energy just becomes increasingly less abundant and a little bit more expensive, and we funded our prosperity, certainly in the United States since the 1980s, with debt. We've essentially brought future energy that we wouldn't get into the future. We've brought it into the present in the form of debt, and that worked just great, or it seemed to work great for a while. Well, we kind of ran to the end of the road with that, and so in the United States, one of the great folk heroes of modern recollection is Ronald Reagan, who somehow figured out how to turn around the declining fortunes of the United States of America, and the way he did it, if the truth be known, was through debt. That was Reaganomics, was debt, and that was continued by every U.S. president since then. And we finally reached a point in the early 2000s where that debt had accumulated to a level that, and I'm oversimplifying this grotesquely, but we had a major collapse of our financial system, and we fixed it with more debt, or we thought we fixed it with more debt. And so we've gotten to a point, both as individuals and as a country and as a society, where we're constantly, trying to figure out how to put patches on a system that's founded on essentially living beyond our means. And we've done a pretty good job of it. I got to give us credit. But at some point, that falls apart, and it's falling apart. Now, again, I'm not predicting that we're going to have a collapse and that everybody's going to die. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you can't keep doing this. And most people sort of understand this, at least on an intuitive level. Um, and somebody comes along and says, "Hey, I can fix this." Oh, we're going to go with him. Whatever he or she says, that's because we want to fix it. We want to get things back to the way they were. Not that things were so great before, but we don't remember we don't remember the bad stuff. We just remember the good stuff. And that's where populism, call it, that's maybe not the greatest word, but I think people know what I'm talking about. That's where it comes from. Where some guy gets up and says, I alone can fix this. I understand how to do this. Maybe the reason, let's just keep all those damn immigrants out. They're stealing our jobs. Or, let's put tariffs on all those damn people in China or wherever that are, trying to screw us. Or, whatever. And of course, it's always a lot more complex than that. But that's the way people, they want to be able to understand it in a simple way. And I don't blame them. We all want to do that. So that is where we're at. That everything that we do, life, is based on energy. And go and you can't question an animal, but every animal knows that. Every insect knows that. Not every human knows that. Where does energy come from? Go ask your dog. Your dog knows exactly where its energy comes from. It comes from, this box in the kitchen that you open up, and there's something in there that somehow ends up in the dog's bowl, and he or she, they got that wired. They know exactly where their energy comes from. The animal on the savannah, and they know exactly where it comes from. I'm hungry. I need to, if I'm a lion, I need to go kill something. I need to go, get an impala. And if I can kill that impala, then I'm good, and my cubs are good for days or a week or so, and then I got to go do it again. But you ask a human, well, where does your energy come from? I don't know. It comes from the wall. I plug something into the wall and things run. Or, I drive my car to a gas station and put a piece of plastic in there and turn it on. That's where my energy comes from. Well, we don't understand that nearly as well as my dog or the cheetah or the lion on the savannah does. They got that absolutely hardwired. They know exactly the answer, and most of us, we don't know. We don't know.
Mm, mm. I want to get to the geopolitical dimensions you were sort of
Yeah.
beginning to talk about. But right before we do that, because I think people hear the word shale and they hear
Mm,
fracking, and it's just kind of like it's that your eyes kind of glaze over. But getting to you also referenced the recession. So talking about the relationship of shale and getting out of the recession, America getting out of the recession, and the associated concept of peak oil. I think these are all really important pieces for people to understand.
okay. So peak oil was the realization that began really in the 1950s as a radical concept that, gosh, there seems to be a finite amount of this oil stuff that ran the United States at the time. And I wonder if I could calculate at the rate that we're using it and how much we think there is, how long this is all going to last. And at a very famous meeting in San Antonio, a couple hours southwest of here, a geophysicist named King Hubbard gave a talk in 1954 that just about got him fired from the oil company he worked for, and even though they knew what he was going to say, and caused quite a controversy. It was in the newspapers the next day where he said that U.S. oil would peak in around 1970, and we don't believe that. It's like climate change. No, that can't be. And actually, he was right. It turned out. So that's where the concept of peak oil came from. And by the time we got to, so I mean, the United States, our oil supply did peak the first time in 1970, and but that was okay because we could import oil from elsewhere to supplement our declining supply. So it wasn't great, wasn't as good as when we didn't have to do that, but it wasn't like a horrible problem. And then we got to around 2003, 2004, 2005, and suddenly the global supply of oil got flat, that we just couldn't seem to get it off of a plateau. And that wasn't because we were running out of oil. It was the problem I described earlier, which is, you discover a new field and it's, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, or it's in the Caspian Sea or something, and there's all sorts of expenses and permits and, decisions that have to be made. And by the time we finally are able to start flowing oil, in this case, from that newly discovered field, we've gone through a whole bunch of oil that we already had, and we end up just kind of staying at zero. We're not finding it fast enough to accommodate the growth in our demand because of more and more progress and more people and etc. So in the early 2000s, it looked like we were in some very serious trouble because the world's demand was increasing, the population was increasing, and oil supply was flat. And then came along this thing called shale, and shale was, it's basically it's the kind of rock in which the oil was generated by nature and managed over geologic time to, kind of leak its way drop by drop up into reservoirs that were unlike the shale, which had, it's like trying to, to suck water out of an ice cube. I mean, the water's there, but it's locked into a form that I just can't get it out. No matter how hard I suck, I can't get it out. And that's the problem with shale, is that there's oil in there. It's just that it has no transmissibility. It doesn't have. It's got little tiny holes in it that are so small that you can't really move a fluid through it. And so in geologic time, as I said, it can work its way, millions and millions of years, one drop at a time. A lot can happen one drop at a time. But civilization, we can't get the oil out of shale one drop at a time. So we came up with a way of drilling into it horizontally. We drill down and then turn sideways, and that exposes the wellbore to a whole lot more surface area, and then we pump crap down there and blow cracks into the shale that creates those pathways by which it is transmissible. We can actually move the fluid into the wellbore, and of course, none of this was like, it wasn't like nobody knew about this. I mean, everybody knew about it. Well, everybody in the energy business, and I mean for 50 years. I mean, the big oil companies had studied this, in the 1960s, the 1970s. It just wasn't commercial. But the U.S. government decided, well, we're going to, give you a bunch of money, as they always do, to try to figure this out. We're going to give you a bunch of tax credits and such, if you can, so you can make this. And by 2006, 7, 8, the price of oil had gone in today's dollars, we got to almost $200 a barrel in 2008. And then everything collapsed in the financial crisis. But by 2010 or so, 2011 through most of 2014, in today's dollars, the average price of oil in the U.S. was like, $125 a barrel. And at $125 a barrel, you can make money off of things that you absolutely could not at half the price. And so the combination of the urgency, the the incentives, the economic incentives, the high price, and the low cost of money, because you remember after the financial crisis, interest rates were pretty much zero. You combine all those things, and suddenly the United States was, not suddenly, but over a couple of years, we were producing 3, 4 million barrels a day from something that had produced zero. So that was a revolutionary change in the world balance of oil. And one of the results was that in late 2014-15, the markets kind of recognized this, and the price of oil collapsed, and it stayed low for quite a few years. But anyway, that's the shale story. The question that everybody asks is, well, why can't we just do this everywhere in the world? And the answer is it's complex, but you can't. And there are geological reasons, but there's also an important, I guess you call it a fiscal or a contractual reason, which is that the United States and Canada are really the only two countries in the world that have a lot of oil reserves in which anybody can go out and buy a lease. Anybody. I mean, it can cost you money, but there are no restrictions except having the money. And so the incentive for somebody that owns a lease is if an oil company comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to include your lease in my unit, and if I discover oil, you get 20% right off the top." What a deal that is! I do nothing. I spend no money, and every month I got a check for 20% of what's produced. So if I'm a leaseholder, and I mean, it's not obvious, but I mean, there are millions of people in the United States that own leases. And every time somebody drills a well, they make a ton of money. And so there's a tremendous incentive for them to say, "You want to drill? Be my guest. Come on in." Well, that's not true in most countries in the world. You go to Mexico, and all those leases, they're owned by the government. And that's true in almost every other country in the world. And so somebody comes in and wants to, make a mess of your surface, your farm or your backyard, and bring in trucks and make mud and put an oil rig and production stuff out there. You get nothing. There's no incentive for you whatsoever. You just have to put up with it. And so in places like Europe, where there is not this private ownership, whenever the government proposes, "Hey, we got a great idea. We're going to do what those Americans did. We're going to start drilling shale wells," and the people get, it's like, they're outside Frankenstein's castle. "No, you're not. We don't want that mess." Now, if we were to make some money, if we were to get 20%, we might think about it. But no, you're not going to do it. So, just on the purely financial side of it, there are just very few places in the world where there's any incentive for people to do this. Now, it also happens, just coincidentally, that an awful lot of the places where the shale exists in the United States are very remote. And so that kind of operation, most of us don't have to see it. It doesn't really affect us. Now, if you live in Pennsylvania, for instance, or parts of Ohio or New York, and the shale gas phenomenon spread to you, well, there were a whole lot of pissed off people because they didn't want it in their backyard. Okay, as long as you want to do that in some godforsaken part of West Texas where nobody lives, that's fine with me. But no, you're not going to do that in my county. Not going to happen here. And so that. But then there are geological reasons which are even more compelling, and it just so happens that that there are, like with almost everything, there's some places that are sweet spots for this stuff. And just because there's shale everywhere, it's not the right kind of shale. It's or it's not mature enough. It hasn't been cooked enough. It hasn't generated the oil yet, or it's not deep enough and doesn't have enough pressure to come to the surface, or it's too deep. And we just absolutely technologically can't do these crazy things like turn sideways and pump fluids down and frack it. So the idea that suddenly this opened up a whole new supply, 100% true. The idea that this goes on forever, absolutely untrue. Now it's still going strong, and that's a good thing. Well, a good thing if you like oil anyway. We basically bought ourselves a decade or a decade and a half. That so the crisis in the early 2000s when oil was on a plateau, we solved that problem temporarily, and we're approaching it again
Mm. Right, because there's also this question of, I've seen it written both ways: energy return on energy invested and energy return on investment.
now. Right. So at some point, it takes more energy to get energy than it's worth it to you from an investment perspective. Now, that argument, I think, is a little bit exaggerated in the case of oil. And for those who don't understand that, I say, well, as long as a company is able to make a profit by drilling and producing oil, then it's probably a pretty good proxy for the energy return on energy invested is positive. Now, it may be getting increasingly less positive over time. In fact, that's basically what I'm saying. But it's still positive enough that I don't lose a lot of sleep over energy return on energy invested. I, vigorously engage in debates and disputes about it, but it's a little bit abstract for most people to understand. Is
Mm.
and it's an elegant idea that has some real practical limitations, and it's not because it isn't a good idea. It's because the amount of things you have to know, the amount of energy that is required to do all of these things to make all of the parts for the rig and the drilling rig and the diesel that you're going to run it with and all of the materials that are used in the drilling and production, that information is really, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about it. And when I get involved in these discussions or debates with EROI experts, so called, I say, look, you guys, I spent a lot of my life in the oil business, and I got to tell you that just coming up with reliable numbers for what's it going to cost to drill the damn well, what are our operational costs going to be once we've drilled the well and have it producing, and what's the price of oil going to be, so that I can calculate when do I ever get to pay all this back and start making money. Just knowing those couple of pretty straightforward things is damn hard. And when I compare knowing those three things to the tens of thousands of things that you need to know to figure out the energy return on energy invested, it's hopeless. It's just absolutely hopeless. And I don't mean to kind of pull rank on these people, but how many of you guys have ever tried to figure out those couple of three, four simple things that you need to know to make money on an oil well or make money on a coal mine or make money on a solar panel? And the answer is, we never did that. Oh, so why do you? So having never done that, what makes you think that you can actually come, with a whole bunch of equations that you're going to figure out the CROI deal? Um, and again, I'm not meaning to be critical. I'm just trying to put some calibration points on how real it is. It's a
Mm.
good idea. It's a great idea. I've never been able to find a way to use it except on a a very high level sort of conceptual basis. I mean, I can tell you, for instance, that green hydrogen, okay, hydrogen made that doesn't use any natural gas or fossil fuels, it takes 3 times as much energy to make it as you get out of it. Okay, we don't need to have any kind of, you know, peer review or PhD dissertation to understand that ain't going to work. You know, we don't need to get out Excel or anything. If it takes 3 times more energy in than you get out, that's a loser. That's an absolute loser. Okay, but unfortunately, for most of these other things, it's not that straightforward. But the next time anybody hears about how green hydrogen is the next up and coming winner, remember that ask the question: have you guys figured out how you're going to solve the problem that it takes 3 times more energy in than you get out? Well, we certainly wish you hadn't asked that question. Well, if you give us enough subsidies and tax incentives, we can make money on it, or we can break even. But what about me? What about the poor Slav who ends up having to heat my house with your green hydrogen? And I have to keep saying I'm not against green hydrogen. I'm just saying that it's like concrete. We don't know how to do it in a way that makes sense in the world at any kind of scale. And I'm not even talking about the whole world. I mean, let's just power our little village of 250 people with green hydrogen. No, we don't know how to do that in a
Mm.
way that doesn't bankrupt our little village of 250 people. I wish it were easier, but it's just not.
Mm. Well, it gets at that paradox that so many of our assumptions are predicated on a progress narrative and our cleverness and intelligence, which itself is predicated on having this abundant, cheap energy source that we sort of magicked into existence.
Well, good point. But when you actually analyze, like how significant is that technology and innovation in the scheme of things? Um, that's a narrative in and of itself that's just not true. And you can come up with all sorts of anecdotal reasons why you believe that. Say, oh yeah, but I mean, look at the steam engine. I mean, surely, I mean that was a massive shift in technology and innovation. I mean, look at the things that we could do because we made the steam engine. Or, people always like to talk about the iPhone. I don't know why, but yeah, look, I mean, before 2000, I don't know, 2006 or whatever, nobody had an iPhone. Now everybody's got one. Isn't that awesome? Well, yeah, okay, that's fine. It is, but if you actually look at productivity data, and this is available. I mean, I mean, the Bureau of I can't remember, the BES or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I can't remember what it is, but you can download an Excel spreadsheet that shows you productivity data for every industry in the United States from about 1950 forward. And what I found when I analyzed that data is if you take the biggest technology and innovation breakthroughs of my lifetime, which are computers and the internet, and you put them together, you come up with an improvement over the baseline of about 0.5% increase that lasted about 10 years, and then it went back to the baseline. Now, it's kind of hard to justify a progress narrative that gives you 0.5% boost for 10 years. I mean, I'll take it, right? It's good. But I think it's most people, if they accept that number, would say, well, that can't be because that's not enough. All right. So these are, it's, I mean, Facts are stubborn little things. And the truth is that if I correlate all of the, or I look at all of the increases and decreases in productivity or economic growth, let's just say that, and I plot that next to changes in the growth of oil supply, man, it's dead on. Okay, so we're back to where we started. That it's what the leopard knows and the dog knows that humans don't know, and that is if I have a higher quality source of food or energy, I win. If you don't, you lose. It's just that simple. I hate to say it, and I'm not saying that technology and invention are not important. They are, but again, you have to calibrate them to what actually matters on any kind of a scale. Now, I mean, just to give you a mundane example, um, I mean, AI has quantitatively changed my life as an energy analyst and writer. I mean, I can do what I do much faster and much better than I could a year ago. So on a very specific basis, it changed my life completely. But how scalable is that to the whole world? And the answer is, do I think that AI will fundamentally change the world? No, I don't. I think it's I'm not even sure it's a good thing, but let's just say that it isn't going to be some dystopian sci-fi future, which a lot of people that know more about it than I do worry about. But let's just say that's off the table. Will it have benefits? Sure. Will it fundamentally change life in the world? No. I mean, if computers and the internet couldn't do it, I mean, why? Let's wait and see, obviously. But isn't it kind of in the same class of things as that? And so am I contradicting myself that I just told you that it's fundamentally changed the way I do things? But then the question is, well, how representative am I in what I do of the way most people are in the world? And I would say I'm not special. I'm not arguing that. It's just the kind of stuff. I mean, how many people do you know that spend their whole day worrying about all kinds of boring data about oil and solar panels and concrete and write about it? Not very many. And it's a tiny little subset of the world. So that's that. So I think we just have to take a breath periodically and step back and just say, all that's great, and I'm all for it. But let's let's look at this in the light of day and say, do I really want to bet civilization on something that is new and hasn't happened yet? Or should I risk it appropriately, just like I would an investment or a decision, and say, hey, I'll give you the fact that maybe there's a 5% chance that I'm wrong about shale, that AI can fundamentally change the way civilization is, and there's a 95% chance that it won't. So I'm gonna put a little bit of my hope or even my investment on 5%, but I'm sure not going to put a whole lot.
Mm.
I'm going to put a little bit, and if it's a home run, great. And if it's a bust, no big deal, right? I mean that's another thing that I do. I mean, I do risk analysis for investments, And that's what I've learned. And what I've learned is that if you calibrate those risk assessments to history, what you find is that anything that I invest in that has less than a 20% chance of success, however that's determined, I'm probably going to lose money on. I mean, that's not an opinion. It's not an opinion. That's empirical. And so, if you think that AI has less than a 20% chance of changing the world, then historically, it's probably a bust. That's not my hope. That's just the way numbers work. And if I'm saying it's 5%, and I think it is 5%, some people will make out like bandits on AI. And you know what? They're the same people that are making out like bandits on industrial capitalism. It's the 1% or the one half of 1%. They're the ones that funded all this thing. It's I mean, if you honestly think that people are gonna use it to benefit society, well, maybe when they're all done getting richer, they. I don't want to be cynical, but that's just kind of the way the world works.
Well, there's not a lot of noblesse oblige anymore. So we're seeing less and less of that kind of like investing back in public institutions. The other thing with AI is it has an incredible energy toll. Like it
Mm.
requires so much energy. And of course, there's now these vectors of like, rebooting 3 Mile Island, and like maybe it's a vector for increasing investment in nuclear energy, and we'll see how that goes. But what you're kind of kicking up in my mind is like, I got into The Great Simplification, who I know you referenced Nate Hagens earlier. I read How the World Really Works by Václav Smil, encountered your work through The Great Simplification a few years back, kind of all around the same time. And one takeaway that I was left with that I think of oil, like it's so coded as a negative thing in my mind because I've come to correlate it with carbon emissions and, therefore climate change and all the things we know about. But the one sort of countervailing point that I came away with was, oh wow, oil is precious, and we should actually be using it highly strategically. So getting back to your point about AI, it's not just an ambient economic bet we're making; it's also a bet against something else we could be doing with all that energy that we're spending proverbially to put into it.
No, that's a great point. And what I would say generally about technology is whatever you think about it, it's not free. And and so I think most people have this unrealistic idea that it kind of is free, and it's just not. I mean, all this horizontal drilling and fracking and all the stuff that we talked about earlier, I mean, it increased the cost of drilling an oil well by 4 or 5 times. Now, the fact that people could still make money off of it, I guess, is good, but it's certainly moving in the wrong direction of efficiency. Okay, if my cable or optic fiber company comes to me and says, "Hey, we can get you 5 times as many stations or channels and at twice the speed as you got right now. Want to sign up? Sure. What's it going to cost? Well, it's going to cost 5 times more." Oh no, no thanks. I'm happy with all the crap, the 400 channels I got right now. No, I'm not willing to pay 5 times or 4 times more to get something that I don't need beyond what I'm satisfied with now. And those are the kind of questions. But I think the underlying issue and problem is psychological. That most people, if they're honest with themselves, know that things in the world are not really too great at the moment. Most people know that things are not as great for them as they were not so long ago. Most people know that their situation is not necessarily going to be better than their parents, and that it's a real stretch to imagine that their children's situation is going to be as good as theirs. Most people get that. Not that it's correct, but that's just sort of what most people feel, which is why they always want to change whoever they're voting for, or something like that. And so when somebody comes along, I said, well, some populist guy comes along and says, well, I got the answer. Let's keep all the damn immigrants out. That'll fix it. Somebody comes along and says, hey, nuclear will fix all this, or renewables will fix all this, or AI will fix all. We need to look at it the same way. I mean, I want to believe it's true, but there's something in me that says, well, if it sounds too good to be true, maybe it is. I mean, that was, weren't we all sort of taught that by our parents? I mean, be careful of what you believe, which I want to believe, and then what am I willing to bet myself on? And I would say that most of these things that people get all excited about, whatever it is, and I just rattled off a bunch, are probably not anywhere near as good as they seem to be. Nuclear is a great example. If you take everything off the table that's bad about nuclear, like what are you going to do with the waste, and the potential danger, or the cost, or whatever. Okay, all that's gone. We're not going to consider that right now. It's like a science experiment where we can ignore friction and gravity. No problem. What would it take to get enough energy from nuclear to account for, let's say, 10% of our electric power needs in a country like the United States? It would take building something like 25 or 30 nuclear power plants a year, at least. All right. Well, what's the history of building nuclear power plants in the United States? Well, we built 7 or 8 of them in 2022. We built maybe 25 or 30 or maybe even 40 between 2000 and 2022. So we're talking about building more every year than we built in the past 25 years. And that's just to get to, 8 or 10% of our electric power needs. So right away, any reasonable person would say, well, I don't think that's going to happen. And again, money's not an issue, permitting's not. It's just the scale. We can't build them fast enough to move the needle. Can't do it. And I'm not against nuclear energy, not at all. I'm just saying, here's the facts, man. So you do something that is pretty much impossible, and it only gets you to 10%. And I mean, so nuclear is 20% of our electric power. So I'm thinking 10% of our total. So let's just say 30 or 40% of electric power. I mean, that's an improvement, but look at what you have to do to get there. Look at what you have to do, and you got to do it every year for 25 years. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Right, or the strategy needs to sort of honestly face, like, if that is something that we believe in, then we have to publicly fund that, or some mix of private public funding, like, that's not something that we can just kind of, like, expect will just happen.
Well, it's back to my example of the cable stuff. Are you willing to pay 5 times what you are right now as a taxpayer? Because I just pulled that out of the air, and most people would say, "Hell no, hell no." I'm having a hard enough time making ends meet as it is. No, I'm not spending 5 times more in taxes. Okay, then you're not signing up for this. Right, right, got it. And the other thing I think that people don't get is that nuclear, renewable, all this stuff, it's all for electricity. And electricity is less than 20% of all the energy we use. So all these great plans of, wind turbines and solar panels and electric and hydrogen and all this stuff, what about the 80%? Whoops. Well, most people don't know that. They don't understand that. But that's the truth. And I don't say this to be negative or pessimistic. It's just that's the way it is. And so the predicament that we face is so much bigger than most people imagine it to be. And so what's the answer? People say, what's the answer, Art? I mean, got to give me an answer. Well, if you want the simple answer is we either need to decide to use a whole lot less energy than we're using right now, or let nature impose that upon us. And the former is never going to happen, so it's going to be the latter. And when that happens, because I told you, and people can look at my website, I mean, I've got graphs coming out the wazoo that show the 100% correlation between oil and economic activity, or energy and economic activity. If we use a whole lot less energy, that means that our living standards are going to drop substantially. Put simply, we're going to be poorer. And we're going to be able to support a much smaller population on planet Earth. Oh, well, what's going to happen to all those people? Well, I don't know. But again, if, just rule of thumb, if 2.5 billion is the right number and we got 8 billion, what has to happen to the 4.5 billion people that aren't included?
Five and a half.
5.5. There you go. And let's say I'm wrong. Let's say the right number is 5 billion. Hell, let's say it's 7 billion. Oh, great. Only 1 billion people have to die. Isn't that good news? No, that's terrible news. How are we going to do that? You won't find that comment anywhere in the platform of the Sierra Club or Just End Oil, Just Stop Oil. But that is a necessary consequence of using less energy. So we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it voluntarily, and so nature will impose it on us, and it'll be reasonably ugly when it happens.
My hope is that it's neither one nor the other, but rather there are uh, events that happen that are maybe, let's call it, economically cataclysmic enough that it induces, much stronger regulations, or people being much more willing to commit to that 5 times more expensive for only double the, increase in value or whatever. Like, I guess this is my way of kind of cracking open the sort of geopolitics part of this conversation, and how, I guess, not just geopolitics. I think there's a domestic politics question that you've kind of talked about with the rise of populism, but then also how this factors into what's happening globally. And I don't know, maybe I'll just leave it there, and then I have a lot of other follow-up questions that I'm sure
Well,
will
just
come.
a simple comment on that is, I mean, the fiscal drain of the continuous wars that the United States and many of the other people in the world have been fighting for, well, kind of forever, but certainly for the last 20 years, is immense. It's absolutely immense. I mean, we talk about, we talked earlier about peak oil in 1970. Well, for those who weren't alive at the time or who conveniently don't remember, I mean, the 1970s were a really terrible time in the United States. I mean, all the progress narrative was absolutely falling on its face. Um, we had huge unemployment. We had great competition from Japan and Germany that we just paid to rebuild. Um, we peaked our oil production. We got to inflation levels by the early 1980s that, we talk about the consequences of raising rates to 4% recently. I mean, we had rates of 18% in the early 1980s. And so when I said, that St. Ronald came along and solved all that with debt, I mean, that was a hallelujah in a way. Um, but the point is that um, if you want to keep fighting wars, and let's face it, I mean, these wars are over things like resources. I mean, they're over oil and uranium and grain. I mean, we can fancy them up and talk about, how they're against all the indignities of, a country invading a sovereign country, or the horrible things that Hamas did, to Israeli young people at a festival music. I mean, all, but I mean, the real issue is always, I mean, it's always about natural resources. And so we're not fighting these wars just because they're fun, or, I mean, people make money off it. Let's not, confuse that. But I mean, these are the very real issues of figuring out, who gets what's remaining in the world of oil. I mean, the Middle East is central. Russia is central. Ukraine is central. I mean, these, and you don't have to know a lot about the history of politics to understand that, these things just don't happen coincidentally. They happen for a reason. And so at some point, you can't just keep doing this. You can't. I mean, the debt load is such that you just can't keep doing it. And yet, we have a president who when asked recently, and this is a totally non-political statement, well, what about the fiscal demands of fighting a war in Ukraine and the Middle East? And he said something like, well, we can absolutely do. By God, this is the United States of America. To which I said, and, I mean, nobody can keep doing that. So, kind of back to where we started. My intent in this discussion is not to bum everybody out, but to try to establish some objective guardrails around what's feasible going forward. And there are guardrails, there are limits. And whether you believe that there are limits to natural resources or not, I mean, we can have that argument. But I don't think anybody would argue that there's a limit to how much debt a country can incur before it starts negatively affecting every person who lives in that country. And money is nothing more than a claim on energy. So we're kind of right back to the beginning. It all comes back to energy in the end. It always does. And I don't say that because that's my field. It's because energy is the organizing principle of life, and every animal on earth except humans understands that.
So how do you track signals for, like, obviously you're trying to communicate this message. People are in large part probably not receptive to the to how scary what the implications of it are. Though of course, you're a leading analyst, and I think there in recent years has been more and more receptivity to these types of ideas. Maybe that's just my read. That feels anecdotal, but that's how it feels. How are you or what signals are you identifying to try to make this case in the energy markets? And how are you presenting them in a way that they, find the most, I don't know, have the most receptive audiences?
Well, I'm not on a crusade. I mean, if you come to me and ask, I will tell you what I think. And so, you know, I have 40 some odd thousand people who follow me on Twitter or X, and you know, a few tens of thousands on LinkedIn and Facebook, and I do a lot of writing and I give talks and stuff like that. But nobody's required to come. I'm not trying to persuade anyone of anything. I'm just not that powerful, nor am I the right guy to do that. Um, what I what I think I'm pretty good at is if you want answers to things that are on your mind, I think I'm fairly good at giving you an answer based on data that you can understand. It doesn't require an advanced degree in something. It doesn't require that you get out a pencil and paper and follow me on, you know, on an equation or something like that. And so my audience is a relatively small subset of the world. It's people that want to know what's happening based on what I think I know from doing a lot more research and having more experience than you do. And who the hell would want to do that? I mean, why? You know, again, it's back to, you know, my HVAC or my cardiologist. I mean, if I have a heart problem, I don't want to go to school and become a cardiologist. I mean, I don't have enough time. I'm going to call a guy who's got that experience. So I'm not trying to put anything out there except for people that want to know. And I think that the world is a pretty confusing place. In my little part of it, in energy and how that affects the economy and human behavior and economics and the environment and a few other things, is something that I'm reasonably comfortable talking about. I'm not an expert on all of those subsets. I know people who are, and you know, if you want to check out something I said about, say, economics, I'll refer you to stuff you can read online for free or get on their website and ask them questions or on their podcast. But you know, I'm reasonably honest about what I know and what I think I know and what I'm not really sure about. And if you want me to share with you what 45 years of working on this stuff has led me to, I'm glad to do that.
Mm.
And to some extent, I'm willing to debate with you as long as the intent is understanding the truth as I see it, rather than, you know, you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong, because ultimately those are going to be based on belief, and I'm never going to win, and you're never going to win an argument based on belief. And not everybody particularly wants to be rational, and that's
Well,
okay too.
I mean, we can both agree that the Democratic Party is cloud seeding in order to send hurricanes to the southeast of the United States.
They can control the weather, absolutely. Nobody else can, but they can. People that wouldn't even, you know, be able to pass a freshman exam in meteorology can send hurricanes to their political opponents. Sure, why not?
Let me ask you something. You worked in the oil industry for a couple decades.
Yeah.
You talked about, like, when you were first confronted with the idea of climate change, like, you didn't want to believe it as well. How much of your time working in the oil industry involved this transition in your thinking toward, you know, what your current thinking is?
Um, Pretty close to zero.
Mm,
I mean, my my job was very specific, as most people who work in companies, pretty specific. You know, this is the area that we want you working on, or this is the the sector we want you analyzing, and the boundaries are a little bit unclear, but we certainly don't want you, you know, going into orbit around Pluto or something, because that's not what we're paying you to do. And so part of it was just that, and the other part was I left. Um, I left the oil industry in the late 1990s, and so um, I think Hanson's meeting with Congress about climate change. I don't remember if it was '86 or '88, but I mean it was so. So the public consciousness about this was, I mean, and again, climate change is certainly not the only thing we ought to be thinking about here, but it's an example people can relate to. I mean, it was still pretty new back then, so not a lot of people working for oil companies or any companies were particularly thinking about it. Yeah, some whack job got up in front of Congress and said some crap, that the world is ending or something. And the end of growth, I actually did. I not only read it, but I was forced to read it by one of my bosses in 1978, believe it or not. And that absolutely, Club of Rome report, that bummed me out royally. I mean, that really, I was like, why did you have me read that? That's so depressing. But so, I mean, I'm not saying that I didn't have, I mean, obviously my thinking was not stagnant in those 20 years, but it was mostly what I got paid for was tell us where to drill wells and where not to drill wells and what's our risk and how does that compare with other places that we have opportunities. That was what it was about. And it
Mm,
wasn't until I went out on my own in the very late 90s that the world changed and suddenly I had to do whatever a client asked me to do. And if that ask had to do with solar panels or offshore wind or some lawsuit over methane contamination of water supply in upstate New York, well, okay, that's what I'm going to work on right now, and not what the company wanted me to do. And I had to be very honest with a lot of those clients and say, look, I can do this, but I'm not an expert on that, and maybe I'm not your guy. Maybe you ought to call somebody that, well, no, we're comfortable with you. So in other words, you're gonna pay me my consulting fee to learn. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's pretty cool. Um, but so yeah, I think the honest answer is I didn't learn. I didn't expand very much working for an oil company, but I think a lot of it was just the times that I was in,
mm,
and a lot of it was just the way companies work.
mm. Were there particular moments you can think back on in that consulting journey that you think of as, like, pivotal kind of turning points or evolutions in your thinking, or was it more of a gradual, evolution that didn't necessarily have louder moments than others?
Oh, there were certainly moments, but I think the the what comes to mind mostly is that whenever I would start a project, whether it be for a client or as the editor of a geological society bulletin, I had to write a monthly article, from the editor, or just something that I'm going to write for my blog. Every time I've done that for 25 years, I think I know the answer before I start, and by the time I'm done, I had no idea what the right answer was, and in fact, the tentative title that I chose needs to go in the trash because the process of doing the research fundamentally changed everything that I thought about. something that I thought I knew the answer to going into it. And it's true that we very rarely undertake projects, any of us, for which we don't have a reasonable level of confidence that this is going to work out the way I think. It's a bad investment, right? But luckily, I'm in an area where it's all sort of a thought experiment, and it takes my time for sure, which I guess translates into money one way or another. But yeah, that's a pretty unique experience to have every week. And what I've I won't say I've learned, what I've experienced is that everything has so much more uncertainty and ambiguity than I ever believed possible before that. And most people are not very comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, including me. But when it becomes my job to live with uncertainty and ambiguity, I guess I got more and more accustomed to it. Okay. And so people often accuse me of being sort of hard headed or even arrogant sometimes in my views or opinions. And it's true that after a while, I just get tired of endlessly going over the same ground with people that are unwilling to expand the basis of their information and their knowledge. And I do get, I mean, I say, okay, look, I've kind of had it here. Well, you're an arrogant SOB because you won't continue. I go, look, all these arguments you're using, I've addressed, and they've been addressed by thousands of people before me. And the fact that you don't want to believe it is your choice. But we're not getting anywhere here, so I'm done. I got better things to do than go over the same ground. Oh, well, you're an arrogant, you got psychological problems, and all you want to do is satisfy your ego. And going, oh my God, okay, fine. But I just think that that we just don't really know much more than what we can describe about the present and how that relates to historically what we believe has taken place in the past. And to me, that's what science is. It's about recording observations and trying to explain the current state of a situation. And everybody wants to know the future. They want to know what's going to happen, next month or next year, or what are your recommendations? And I say, well, I got a lot of uncertainty about just, explaining the present right now to you. And if I can't do that, and I think I can actually, as long as you accept my, kind of my error bars on that. But you want to jump to the future, and we haven't even agreed on the present, where we got data and we're living it right now. And so if you can't even agree that things aren't as great as you hoped they would be about the present, then what in the hell are we doing having a discussion about how hopeful you are about the future because of whatever, AI or nuclear? I mean, can we just stay with what we know before we go there? I mean, I'm willing to go there with you, but I'm not willing to, jump out of an airplane without a parachute. Let's make sure we got the equipment here before we jump out of the plane. So I guess that's the experience that I've had, and with things like, again, let's just talk about climate change. It's every time I read a paper or have a conversation or somebody puts a comment on my website, or somebody responds to what I say on Twitter, it's like, wow, okay, that's a new wrinkle. I hadn't thought about that before. How does that affect my thinking? Well, I don't know right now, but I think I'm real glad that you brought that up. I don't quite know what to do with that yet. I mean, I just heard a talk last week it was about climate change, and the guy who gave the talk is a old friend and colleague of mine. I've known him forever. I've collaborated with him. Um, I have looked at his presentations in the past. He sends them to me. There wasn't a thing he said that I didn't know. And yet, the way he strung it together just blew me away. I came out of that talk fundamentally changed in my, on some qualitative level about how I looked at climate change. How is that even possible? And yet, there you go. There's the mystery of it all. It was a transformative moment in some way for me.
Amazing.
It is amazing.
Shout out to your colleague.
Good guy, smart guy. Made me think.
Amazing. I have 3 questions that I like to close each episode with. You've inevitably answered these in some capacity, so feel free to call back in something that you already said or take it a totally different direction. The first is, what is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I wish people would pay more attention to what people who actually know their field think before deciding that they know more than that person does or that group of people. I'm not suggesting that they should or necessarily need to agree, but they really ought to consider what someone who has spent considerably more time than they have researching and understanding something, what they think about it before they move on, rather than just, oh, I don't agree with that and I don't agree with that. Just listen to them. Just hear them out. And and that obviously comes from sort of a personal place that, if people want to take my time, and I'm glad to give them my time, would you please do me the courtesy of listening to what I have to say before going point by point, and well, that's not true, and that can't be, and you're just a political hack, or you're a shill to whatever. But I think there ought to be some level of respect for the fact that the person that I'm communicating with has a body of knowledge and experience that I don't have, and I ought to hear that person out. Doesn't mean I have to agree with them. Doesn't even mean I have to like them. But if I'm gonna take that person's time, I need to listen to what he or she has to say. So that's the answer to that question.
Mm. Well, it's like your point earlier, like you can disagree with your cardiologist, get a second opinion, but you should hear them out while they're sitting there talking to you.
Unless you want to do surgery on yourself, or get somebody who got a degree from Google University. I mean, you can do that. You can do that.
Well, speaking of Google University, what is one resource you use to make better sense of reality, or that you recommend?
Well, you've mentioned a few of them, and I'll just leave it there. I think if you're interested in energy, um, learn more about what Václav Smil has to say. I mean, there's no one who has a better big picture of energy than that person. And he's written, I don't know how many dozens of books. Any one of them is worth reading. Or if you don't want to take the time to read him, just get online and find a couple of articles, interviews with him or summaries that other people have done. The second, you mentioned that you followed the Great Simplification and Nate Hagens' work. When he last asked me on the show, he always has a question, if you could wave a magic wand with no recourse, what would you have everybody do? And I told him, watch every one of the episodes on this station, which is never going to happen. But for as much as I sometimes think I know, and how much I don't really want to listen to somebody talk about something that I either think I know about or I'm not really all that interested in, I always listen, and I almost always come away with, wow, that was really different than I thought, and I learned a lot. So Nate's is not the only one, but if you're interested in the kinds of things we're talking about, that's certainly a great place to start. And
Could not. Yeah.
I'm not promoting. I mean, he doesn't make any money off of that. I'm just saying I'm following your lead. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I could not recommend The Great Simplification more, so I co-sign this message entirely. Been
Okay,
a huge
good.
influence for me. Um, and the final question is, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Hmm. Well, I think I've mentioned one recently, um, but I'll go back to something that happened to me in school. Back when there were dinosaurs wandering the earth, I took an exam it happened to be a geology class, but it doesn't really matter. And out of 90 people who had all survived 3 years at this very rigorous and kind of pain in the ass engineering school that I was going to, um, all but three failed the exam, and I got a D. I made an appointment with that professor, and I reamed him out. I said, you are a terrible teacher. I mean, how in the world can you fail people who have survived 3 years at the Colorado School of Mines, all of them except for three, and think that you're a half-assed decent teacher? And he said, well, he laughed. He said, well, what did you get? I said, I got a D. He said, well, you got one of the best grades in the class. What are you complaining about? And I said, well, I don't look at it that way. And he said, all right, let's take a look at this. And so he dug out in those days it was a written exam. Okay? It was a question, and we had these things called blue books, which I'm sure don't exist anymore. But you wrote your answer with a pencil or a pen and whatever. He said, all right. So what was the question? And the question was, explain the significance of, and it happened to be a geological term that basically related to why is there so much granite in the world. Okay. So he started looking at my book and flipping pages. Oh, I remember you. You're the one that told me everything that there is to know about granite. And you didn't answer my question, but the fact that you told me everything that there was to know about granite, I couldn't give you an F. So I gave you a D. So I was getting more and more pissed off by the moment. This guy's just, what an ass, this guy. And he said, but look, let's go back to the question. Discuss the significance of. He said, you never answered the question. Well, fair, yeah, okay, I see where you're going with this. And he said, so what is the significance of? And I said, well, okay, so I guess the significance is that we now understand that plate tectonics does this, that, and the other, and it causes this to happen, and that causes all this granite to form that wasn't there to begin with, and that's the significance. He said, if you would have written those three sentences, you would have gotten an A. I said, seriously? He said, that's the answer. It's exact. I mean, there are other ways to answer it, but you answered the question. You told me what the significance was. And that was a life changing moment for me, which is kind of weird to say right now because I've never understood that before. I never understood that the answer to a question is not what do you know about it, but what does it mean? That's all anybody really wants. And I've never been the same since then.
Wow. It's a great story. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. I've told it to
Um,
a lot of people because it changed my life. And I could tell you more, but we don't have time for more.
That'll be for I'll have you back. There's a ton of stuff about how history relates to all of this that I wanted to get to with you, but we've been on for plenty long. You've been so gracious with your time. So,
Sure.
the last little bit is basically just to ask anything that has your attention right now that's coming, that's on the horizon, places people can find you, anything
Yeah.
to tease for the future, etc.
Well, yeah, I mean, artberman.com. I write something every week, and usually it pisses a lot of people off and makes a lot of people really happy. And I don't know what the right answer to that is, but it's free. I think you might have to, provide an email address or something before you get through to the content. But there's no ads, there's no fees, there's no subscriptions, there's no nothing. That's where I'd recommend. If you get onto X or Twitter at AE Berman 12, or you go onto LinkedIn, and you can, any of those places. But I spend more time on X than anywhere else, and I'm not really sure why. But that's sort of a brain dump of what's on my mind today. I might change my mind tomorrow, and people will criticize me for it. But as I make graphs and come up with ideas, I just throw them out there and let people tear them apart. And um, usually, I'm better for hearing what people say about that. That's where to find me. And yeah, I mean, join the conversation. It may be exhausting, but in the end, it's kind of fun. It's fun for me anyway.
Well, on that note, yeah, definitely go read Art's website, check out the Twitter. And Art, thank you again so much. This has been a really illuminating conversation.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.